Isn't it funny? Everything God means for good, Satan means for evil.
Twists.
You know, this has been a hard few weeks. You know, we look at America and we see what we've become. Look around. Rioting, looting, burning, killing. For what? Our excuse is somebody was killed by a cop. Last year, I believe there were 9 unarmed African Americans killed. 9. There were 19 unarmed whites killed. Shouldn't we be just as upset about the loss of any life?
Yeah.
They keep asking the question, do Black Lives Matter? Well, they must. Because 750,000 Americans, 40,000 African Americans died in an unprecedented war. No nation had ever gone to war against itself to free its own people before in history, ever.
Wow. Yeah.
And we did. Why? I'll tell you why. Because of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Amen.
We'll talk about it. I never know what I'm going to say when I get up to preach until I start saying it. But I think God is directing me to Matthew chapter 11, verse 12. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. We've seen a lot of violence. Probably $1 billion in damage since these riots and looting and insanity began. This isn't about George Floyd being murdered. This isn't about a guy being dead. This is about a spirit of rage. And by the way, it's not just here. This is a spirit that's been unleashed across the entire globe.
Come on, Dave.
This is the end time. This is the time when that ferocious spirit of evil that Scripture talks about is being released. And if you are going to take hold of the kingdom in this day, you are going to have to take it by force. And until John the Baptist, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. Why? Because if you're going to follow God at this point in time, you're going to have to be serious about it. The violent take it by force. What kind of violence? The violence that goes against everything that Satan stands for in this world. In other words, the day of polite Christianity is over. The day of religious relaxation has gone by. You see, that's what got us here. Yes, the rioters and the looters and the burners and the vile crowd that's out there, they're responsible for their actions, but it is the church that is at fault. Because both nature and the spirit despise a vacuum. And when righteousness leaves, what's left? Unrighteousness. There is no gray in the middle here where you've got righteousness and unrighteousness and this big broad ground of gray area that's sort of in between. There is not. Darkness has no fellowship with light. Period. You take the light out of the room, there's only darkness left. Period. Well, the church stopped preaching. We developed homilies instead. So we've got polite little homilies because they tickle the ears of our listeners, and the truth doesn't grow the church. It grows the kingdom, but not the church. You see, we've got too many pastors building empires and not enough building the kingdom. Why are we here on a Sabbath? Isn't it about law, righteousness? What's the Spanish word for Saturday?
Sábado.
Sábado. Sábado. Where did Sabbath come from?
Sabbath.
Sabbath.
Shabbat.
Shabbat. Sabbath.
Shabbat.
Whose Sabbath is it? The church's Sabbath? The Jews' Sabbath? What does God say? He says, it is my Sabbath. His Sabbaths are forever. And we've lost that. We've lost it because we've compromised on everything else we've done. How would you feel about going to a church that said, listen, we believe in all of the commandments except one. There's one we don't like. Thou shalt not commit adultery. We've decided to chuck that one out. The other 9 we're going to keep, but that particular one, we don't like it. We like the ladies. How comfortable would you be at the church? Or adultery is okay, because that's one of the commandments we decided we didn't like. Well, at what point in time did we decide we didn't like the 4th commandment? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It's a commandment. It's not the church's commandment. It's not the Jews' commandment. It's Yahweh's commandment. It's not the Jews' Sabbath or the church's Sabbath. Yahweh says it is my Sabbath forever. He says, I'm the same yesterday, today, and forever. I don't change. My law didn't just suddenly go away. You know, there are actually churches teaching that the law was nailed to the cross. It doesn't say that. It says the penalty of the law was nailed to the cross. Why? Because in the Old Testament we had sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice. Why? Because it was an incomplete and imperfect sacrifice that couldn't contain the perfect wrath of Yahweh toward sin. But when that perfect sacrifice came, when Yeshua came, the sacrifice was perfect. Therefore, the perfect wrath of God could be placed upon the perfect sacrifice, and forever we are forgiven. He covered our sin. John, in his gospel, says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The word, therefore, word, is logos. Logos. That is the revealed righteousness and nature of Yahweh. In the beginning was the law word, the righteousness of God. In the beginning was the law word, and the law word was with God, and the law word was God, and the law word became flesh and dwelt among us. The law word. The law word became flesh and dwelt among us. And it was from when? From all eternity. You see, nothing changes. God didn't invent the Sabbath after he did the creation. He kept the Sabbath that had always been in heaven for all eternity, and he kept it. Why? Because it was his law. His righteousness. It's who he is. It's what he is. Folks, God's got a memory. He doesn't forget. He doesn't forget his laws. He doesn't forget his people. He doesn't forget history. He is history.
Yes.
You remember when the spies went into Canaan, the promised land?
Mm-hmm.
How long were they there? 40 days.
Yes.
40 days they wandered around. And what did they do when they came back? All but 2, Joshua and Caleb, gave them bad reports. Oh, listen guys, it's a great land. You should see the size of the grapes. It took 4 of us to carry one out. You should see the fruit in this place. It is amazing. It's a land truly flowing with milk and honey. But I can't tell you, we can't go there. Because we got giants. Whoa, man, we got giants.
Yeah.
We got ferocious warriors. We got walled cities. We got camps of people that are going to kill us. Except Joshua and Caleb. And Moses said, are you people insane? Look what God has done. Some of Israel even got together and tried to enter the promised land. Moses said, don't do it. Don't do it. You're going to die if you do it, because God said no more. For every day that you were there spying out the land, you will now spend a year in the wilderness. And none of you who came back with a bad report, none of this generation shall see that land. God has a memory.
Yeah.
That was the year approximately 1313 BC, or as they're saying now, BCE. See, we had to change BC and BCE around. We had to change AD to BC. I mean to CE. Why?
Get rid of
Because
Christ.
Anno Domini is what? After the death of Messiah. And of course, we can't talk about the blood.
That's right.
So now we call it before Christian era and Christian era. But it's just an era. It has nothing to do with Anno Domini, the death of Messiah. That was 1313 BC. And guys, by the way, you know what day it was? The 9th of Av. That happened on the 9th of Av. That's a Hebrew month in the calendar. It's different than the Gregorian calendar. They spied out the land and they came back with a bad report. But God has a memory. And in their wickedness and in their sloth and in their degradation, Israel abandoned God. And the first temple was destroyed in 586 under King Nebuchadnezzar. And guess what day it was? The 9th of Av. The temple was destroyed. The second temple was destroyed by Titus, 70 AD. Guess what day it was? The 9th of Av. God has a memory. The temple grounds, by the way, were plowed a year later in 136 CE. Plowed. Turned under. Like you're going to plant something there. Or like it was a fresh grave. (135 CE). The 9th of Av. The Battle of Batar. What happens? Israel is slaughtered. Why? Because God has a memory. The Jews were expelled from England. Jews were expelled from England in 1290. What day? The 9th of Av. Do you remember the movie with Mel Gibson, Braveheart?
Yeah.
And you had Longshanks in there at King Edward I.
Yeah.
That was Longshanks, Edward Longshanks. He threw the Jews out. And guess what kind of Jews they were that he mostly threw out? Messianic Jews.
Oh, wow.
Why?
They were believers.
Because they followed the Jerusalem church,
Yeah.
not the Roman church.
That's right.
They turned their back on the Roman church and said, we choose to follow the New Testament church, the church of the apostles.
Wow.
And they were thrown out of England in 1290 on the 9th of Av. 1492, what happened? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We learned that when we were little kids. You know what else happened in 1492? Spanish Inquisition. Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen, they're more or less, of Portugal and Spain, decided they were going to throw the Jews out.
Wow.
What day was it? The 9th of Av, because God has a memory.
Wow.
1492, they expelled the Jews. And that created a diaspora. And that diaspora eventually led to those same Spanish Jews populating up and down Central and South America.
Yes.
And if you go to Central and South America, you'll see Sabbath churches dotting the landscape everywhere you go, because they understand Sabbath. Sabbath, the Sabbath. I could give you 100 more examples of things that happened on the 9th of Av. But let me give you current history. Zephaniah 2:4 says that Gaza will be forsaken. Israel pulled out of Gaza and gave it away to the heathen on guess what day? The 9th of Av, 2005. Seems like the more things change, the more they stay the same. The 9th of Av is one of those days that has been a day of blessing and a day of cursing. 1492, the 9th of Av, the Jews are thrown out of Spain. And by the way, from that point on, the Spanish Empire began to crumble. 1492 was about the high point for the Spanish fleet, for the Spanish power. But in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. While they were carrying out the Spanish Inquisition, a guy by the name of Christopher Columbus came to them and said, "Hey, Kingy, old boy, I need some cash. I'd like to go find a new world for you. Bring back gold and jewels and all kinds of loot." And they blessed him and said, "Go, go." What they didn't know was that Christopher Columbus was a Jew from a prominent Jewish family in Italy called Colombo, the Colombo family. Many of them, by the way, had been martyred for their faith because they were Messianic Jews, because they would not abide the new doctrines of Rome and the eschewing of the Sabbath. Little did Ferdinand and Isabella know that this was an Italian Jew. The Jews, the very Jews they were persecuting in Spain and Portugal. And God's biggest joke was he sent an Italian Jew to the Jew haters in Spain and Portugal to get money to go to a new land. And he said, "We're going to bring you back silver and gold." But you know what he said in his diary? "I'm looking for a place where Messianic Christians can come and worship God."
Wow.
Yeah.
So in 1492, in the midst of the Spanish Inquisition for the destruction of Jews, God said, "I've got another plan." So he sent an Italian Jew to the Jew haters in Spain and Portugal, and they financed his campaign to go to the New World, which we eventually found to be America. Yes, they landed south of America in the Caribbean. But it led to this country, this land. (1620). Columbus sails in 1492. Makes a few voyages. And now, of course, everything you read about Columbus now is awful, right? He massacred Indians. He was a murderer. He was a... No. He was a Messianic Christian who went to find a place where people could worship God.
Wow.
1620. People came to this country. 2 ships sailed. Not 1, 2. The Mayflower and the Speedwell. Mayflower was loaded with Christians. Speedwell was loaded with businessmen and entrepreneurs and hucksters and who knows what else. These were people that were sent by business interests in England. On board the Mayflower were some very peculiar people. Have you ever read the Fox's Book of Martyrs? It talks about the gruesome deaths carried out by England, by Germany, by France, by Italy, by Spain on believers. Some of them so horrifying that they're hard to repeat even. But I'll tell you about one man. He and 2 of his other friends were captured by the Inquisition in England. They were jailed. And the 3 talked about how it was going to be. They were going to be burned at the stake. And they all wondered, do we have the faith to go through this? Or will we sell out? And the guy that was going to be going first, an older man, who had lived a lot of life, loved God all of his life, he was to be first to die. So he told his younger comrades who were shaking in their booths, he said, listen, if God gives me grace to go through this, even in the fire, I'll raise my hand and put up 3 fingers so that you know the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are here with me, giving me grace to go through this. So they took him out. Tied him to the stake. Gathered the wood around him. They gathered the wood, by the way, after they tied him to the stake, because they wanted it to be a bit more torturous, watching them build the kindling around him.
Wow.
And they lit the fire. First it burned on the outer edges, and then it moved in, closer, closer, and closer. And the smoke and the fumes gagging him, choking him, charring his face and his lungs, and he stood, praising God the whole time. It made him crazy. Here he is, being burned alive, and he's praising God. And the fire engulfed him. There was nothing but flames. They could see even his body was on fire. His hands were burning. And while his hands were on fire, 3 fingers came up out of the cloud of smoke and fire to tell his brethren, God's grace is here. There is grace even in the fire. 1620. By the way, that was not uncommon, by the way. For anybody that the Roman church didn't like, this is what their fate was. On board that ship, there were pilgrims, and there were also Puritans. Puritans were the guys that were trying to create the church or purify the church from within. These were the guys that didn't leave the Church of England, they stayed, trying to make it better. And many of them had been martyred. Many had been martyred because they disagreed with the king and the king's church, which was sort of a bad policy back then. The other people that were on board were the pilgrims. The pilgrims were people who had already fled England. They had gone to Denmark. So many of them had been butchered, slaughtered, cut to pieces, sawn in half, that they fled and they went to Denmark. So when the Mayflower was ready to sail, they hightailed it from Denmark back to England just in time to get on board ship and get out of England as fast as they could, because they knew their fate if they stayed. What did they come to America for? What was the purpose of their voyage? Wealth? Riches? No, it was find a place they could worship God in peace. Some place where they could bow the knee only to Yahweh, not to a corrupt king, not to princes and lords, but to the Lord. So in 1620, the Speedwell and the Mayflower sailed. They got out, and soon the Speedwell developed leaks. Buy a new ship, by the way. Good ship. Better ship than the Mayflower. A lot better. But it developed leaks. So they had to go back to port. Now you can imagine what the Puritans and the Pilgrims are thinking. Oh God, what have you done? You're sending us back to port? That's like sending Israel back to Egypt. But they went back to port. They fixed up the Speedwell, sailed again. Second time, leaks. Speedwell had to go back, so the Mayflower went back with them. Remember now, this started back in August. August 5th was when they first went. So they sailed yet again a third time. And what happens? Speedwell develops leaks again. Now remember who's on the Speedwell. These are the rascallions, the businessmen, the entrepreneurs, the flim-flam guys, whoever it was. 3 times they go out. Speedwell has to go back. Mayflower says, nope, we're going on this time. We're not going to wait. So on September 6th, 1620, the Mayflower sails. They managed to arrive at Provincetown November 21. On board that ship were 102 souls. About 22 crew, the rest Christian. All Christians. On board that ship, 1 man died in the voyage. And interestingly enough, he happened to be someone who hated Christians. Persecuted them the whole trip. He dies on board ship. 1 baby was born on board that ship. 1. And it was the great-great-great-great-grandfather of a very dear friend of mine who's now gone to be with Messiah. His name was Peter Waldron. His great-great-great-great-grandfather was that person born on board that ship. They arrived November 21 in Provincetown, Massachusetts, finally settled on December 25th at Plymouth, Massachusetts. Christmas Day. By the way, the Pilgrims and the Puritans did not celebrate Christmas. It was a very pagan ritual holiday across Europe, and they decided they didn't want any part of it. And it was, for the most part, the Winter Solstice Festival. If you remember back in 320, we had an emperor who thought he saw God in the sky, a cross in the sky. And we had a pope by the name of Sylvester. Sylvester was about the 7th pope, and the previous 6 had been martyred. So the pope, Sylvester, got together with the emperor, Constantine, and they decided that they would make Sunday the day of worship as opposed to keeping the Sabbath. Why? Because Sylvester didn't want to be martyred by Constantine. And Constantine said, well, we can't keep Sabbath because my whole empire is a sun-worshipping empire. So we'll change it to Sunday, and I'll say for my people that it's the S-U-N day, and you tell the Christians it's the S-O-N day, and we'll all be happy. So in 320, it was changed. Prior to that, the church was a Sabbath church. But on board that ship, there were 28 Puritans who had tried to purify the Church of England from within and failed. On board, there were 52 pilgrims. And those pilgrims were Sabbath keepers. They were Messianic Christians. So 2/3 of the people that came on that ship to this land were Messianic Christians.
Yeah.
They kept Sabbath. And the Sabbath was kept for, in fact, even into the 1800s, we had the Seventh-day Baptists and the Seventh-day Presbyterians and the Seventh-day Methodists. That went on for a very long time. But the land became settled. And as the land became settled, and as things got better, by the way, the first Thanksgiving, we hear this mythology about the first Thanksgiving, that the Indians had to feed the Pilgrims because they were all starving to death. Nonsense. When the Pilgrims landed on the Mayflower, they tried an experiment called socialism. We'll have all things in common. We'll all grow together. You know what? They lost half of the population of that colony the first winter. You know why? They starved to death. They didn't have adequate housing. Why? Because they tried to have all things together, and everybody figured it was everybody else's responsibility to do it. Nobody did it. So we have known since 1620 that socialism was a bad way to go. But yet we still have socialists today trying to run this country into socialism. So that first Thanksgiving, the harvest was so bountiful, so humongous, they knew they could never use all of that even in a hard, cold winter. So they invited the Indians, the Native Americans, to come join them and thank God with them over the bounty that they had received. That was the true first Thanksgiving. But as life got easier for what became Americans, we unfortunately followed the pattern that we so often follow. We got fat, we got dumb, we got happy. Not joyful, happy. And so the church began to wane. The church began to lose its bearings, to lose its righteousness. You see, that's what we're called to. There's only two doctrines in all of Scripture that matter. Everything else is adjunct to those. There's only two. Justification and sanctification. Justification, what God did through His Son on the cross. What Messiah did on that cross. Laying down His Godhead to come to earth. Leaving the princedom of heaven. The glories of heaven. To come down here. You know the beauty of that. We say, the Bible says that Messiah died for all. For every human being. But you know what? The beauty of it is, if you were the only person on this planet, if there was one person, one man, one woman, one sinner on this planet, Messiah still would have come. Because while He loves the whole world, He loves you.
Amen.
He loves you specifically. He died for you specifically. Well, we became fat, dumb, and happy. And then some men came along, like Jonathan Edwards. You may remember that name, Jonathan Edwards. Sinners in the hands of an angry God. His most famous sermon. By the way, Jonathan Edwards was sort of a mild-mannered, calm kind of guy. He wasn't this fiery, blustery, hellfire and damnation preacher. But on that occasion, he saw the lethargy, the sin, the decadence of a town, and he said, I want to tell you what happens to sinners in the hands of an angry God. But you see, the church has lost this, by the way. We've lost this. We forgot that there is a hell. We forgot that there is damnation. We forgot there is hellfire. And we ought to be afraid of that.
Yeah.
That's not a small thing. Eternity is a good long while. But the church has stopped preaching the blood. The church has stopped preaching the cross. The church has stopped preaching eternal life and eternal damnation. Instead, we give nice little homilies now and tell people how to be happy. Well, all the happiness in the world isn't going to bring you joy, because joy is of the Spirit and happiness is of the soul. One is emotional, one is spiritual. So men like Jonathan Edwards and Gilbert Tennant and the great George Whitefield began preaching across the land. George Whitefield, by the way, was an interesting fellow. Powerful preacher. His voice was so powerful he could preach to 100,000 people outdoors and they could all hear him. Now that's a set of pipes that only God can give you. And he preached. And by the way, you know why he preached outside? Because none of the churches of his day, all holier than thou, not one of them would allow him to preach in a church. He said, I don't care. I'm like Brother James. I don't care. I'm hitting the streets. That's where the people are. And that's what he did. He hit the streets. He'd preach at the factories, and he'd preach at the warehouses, and he'd preach in the fields. He didn't care. And when he preached, people would come. He preached to crowds of 50, 75, 100,000. He made Trump's rallies look small. This guy was a preacher of righteousness. And revival broke out. But revival broke out because of who George Whitefield was, and who Jonathan Edwards was, and who Gilbert Tennant was. These men were men of prayer. George Whitefield, before he preached, he would often fast and pray for 2 days before he preached. He said, if it's not bathed in prayer, it's not going to work. And that revival led to America. That was the first Great Awakening, without which there would be no United States. Because what the colonists saw was that the king had taken the rights that only God can possess. In fact, that's what Thomas Jefferson wrote about in the Declaration of Independence. We don't teach this in schools anymore, but you used to 100 years ago. Read in the red history books, which was the one that everybody used, the one the two little old ladies wrote, that Thomas Jefferson, the supposed deist, on June 8th, was given the task of writing the Declaration of Independence. And so he did. Now, for 2 years, they'd been trying to get a Declaration of Independence, something that would say something that all the colonists could agree with and that they could make a change. But the argument was so heated that guns often hit the table when they were debating. That's how serious it was. These folks love politics. So Jefferson, the supposed deist, did not take a political approach to the problem. He wrote, "We hold these truths, not postulates, not theorems, these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." And he used that word endowment for a purpose. Because people there had endowed colleges or had endowed things, and they knew that endowment was a legal term, which means it is the corpus of a piece of lending, the fruits of which the college could use or the church could use, but the corpus itself couldn't be touched. That was the grant of God, His purview alone. So he said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator." That is, given something that only He can touch, not they, not the government, not anyone else. Endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. And he said, "King, you have touched the endowment." And then he listed all of the transgressions of the endowment by King George. And he said he's a heretic because he has touched that which does not belong to him. It belongs to God. And by touching it, he has declared himself God. Therefore, we are not required to split with him for political reasons or for taxation reasons, but because we have no spiritual bond with him anymore, because he's a heretic. Another thing you don't read in history books anymore is that the rallying cry of the late revolution was, "No king but King Jesus." No king but King Jesus. You see, that's the difference. And God has a memory. And with that memory came a victory that could never have happened. It was not just improbable, it was impossible. Nobody could take on the army of England with a few thousand rabble-rousing shopkeepers and businessmen. He had some pot-bellied shopkeepers carrying old guns, facing an armada, the first sailing to come and quell the disturbances in New York. 25,000 troops were there. 25,000. And here you got George Washington with a ragtag army that had no uniforms, very poor weaponry, no central command leadership. And there's Washington facing the mightiest army on planet Earth. And yet they stood. Somehow they stood. Because they entrusted the whole adventure to the hands of God. They said, "God, remember us. Remember who we are. Remember how we got here, who we were when we came. All believers, all your people came here to worship God. That's why they came here. Will you remember us now in this hour of our trouble?" And God remembered them because God has a memory. But we still had to deal with slavery. And in our Constitution we had the fact that, and by the way, the abolitionists put this in. They wanted, that is, the South wanted blacks to have no vote of any kind, no human presence. So the abolitionists found a way to trick them, the slave owners, and said, "Here's what we're going to do. You're going to have some votes. So we're going to make each one of these people 3/5 of a human being. Because it gave them value. It gave them humanity. Now you can read it and say, well, they only counted the 3/5 of a person. But they didn't. The abolitionists saw what they were doing. They were giving them humanity, knowing that in the future that humanity would be counted. But slavery was not going to end on good wishes and hopes. It was the second Great Awakening. The preachers of righteousness who said, this is abhorrent. You cannot buy and sell a human being. God, by the way, said that if you steal a man and you sell him, you carry that with the death penalty. You kidnap someone, it carries the death penalty. If you buy someone who was knowingly stolen, the death penalty also goes on you. And in that great Civil War, 40,000 African Americans gave their lives to gain their freedom. 800,000 Americans gave their lives to free the African population. 800,000. 1 million more were wounded. So they asked, do black lives matter? Apparently, yes.
Yeah, they do.
Because 2 million people sacrificed so that black men could be free, black women could be free, black children could be free. So yes, black lives matter. Because to God, all lives matter. See, God doesn't see skin color, He doesn't see ethnicity, He doesn't see any of that nonsense. What He understands, what He knows is that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So you've got to understand what they went through and what they were willing to give up. It was revival that changed the nation. Revival that cured the sin. It was people going back to the things of God. America's going to have to go back to the things of God, or we have no hope.
Yeah.
Matthew 11:11. Verily I say unto you, among them that were born of women, there hath not risen a greater than John the Baptist. Notwithstanding, he is the least in the kingdom of heaven. The least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. What's Jesus saying? What's Yeshua saying? The greatest that has ever come so far in the line of prophets is John the Baptist, and yet, in this new covenant that is coming, the least Christian in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John the Baptist. That tells you the kind of power that God has rested in His people. That the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John the Baptist.
Wow.
From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. So, if you want to see God, you're going to have to be willing to go violently to the kingdom and take it. That means no halfway measures. That means that all of this religious pandering, all of this religious nonsense is going to have to end, and we're going to have to go back to an understanding that if you're not following hard after God, you're not following God. Period. There is no halfway point anymore. A.W. Tozer is famous for the book The Pursuit of God. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's about living a life that seeks God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, with all of your being. And there's a chapter in there called Following Hard After God, which he got from Psalm 63, a psalm of David. When he was in the wilderness of Judah, O God, thou art my God, early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee, my flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where there is no water. To see thy power and thy glory, so as I have seen thee in the sanctuary. Because thy loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise thee. Because the presence of God is better than life itself. Thus will I bless thee while I live. I will lift up my hands in thy name. My soul shall be satisfied as the marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise thee with joyful lips. When I remember thee upon my bed, and meditate on thee in the night watches, because thou hast been my help. Therefore, in the shadow of thy wings will I rejoice. My soul followeth hard after thee. Thy right hand upholdeth me. That's where Tozer got that understanding. He saw what David saw in God. My soul followeth hard after thee, and thy right hand upholdeth me. But those who seek my soul to destroy it shall go into the lower parts of the earth. They shall fall by the sword. They shall be a portion for foxes. But the king shall rejoice in God. Everyone that sweareth by him shall glory. But the mouth of them that speak lies shall be stopped. God's calling us to revival. But not the kind of revival that we're used to seeing, where you simply put a sign out in front of your church and say, it's revival. That's not revival. That's just another service. Revival happens when prayer happens. And that's the only time it happens, when prayer happens. The Hebrides revival, which is one of the greatest revivals in modern history, late 40s, early 50s. It was a revival, not because they had a great preacher come in, because Duncan Campbell was a lot of things, but a great preacher ain't one of them. But he was a powerful man of God because he loved God with all of his heart, and he talked to the people about sin and righteousness and condemnation and forgiveness. But it happened because two old ladies, one blind, the other crippled, made their way out to a barn every night at 10 o'clock, and from 10 o'clock until 2 o'clock, they prayed.
Wow.
They prayed for revival.
Wow.
And you know the revival prayer? Lord, work in me.
Yeah.
Change me, revive me. You see, I can't bring America to revival. And I can't bring revival to America. I can't bring revival to the state of Texas, nor can I even bring revival to Dallas. But I am assured that I can bring one revival to me, to my heart. What the church has stopped preaching, what the church has failed to understand is that you have a destiny. Every human being has a destiny. God has a destiny for you. Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before thou camest out of the womb, I sanctified thee.
Yeah.
Before the worlds were framed, God knew you. Before eternity began, however that happens, God knew you. And the Spirit of God moved over the face of the deep. It wasn't even earth yet. It was just this blob. And God knew you. And God knew me. And He called me by my name. And He said, son, there is a destiny for you. And only you can walk out that destiny. Nobody else can walk out your destiny. God called you. Which is why I said, if you were the only person on planet Earth, the last living human being here, Messiah still would have come for you. Because you have a destiny in God. Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. Before thou camest out of the womb, I sanctified thee. And how many saints, how many sanctified babies have been butchered on the altar of abortion?
Yeah.
The god Moloch was the god of pleasure. We're still sacrificing our babies to the god of pleasure, aren't we? Because they're financially inconvenient. Or I sowed my wild oats, didn't get a crop failure, so now I got to kill it, got to butcher it. We care about baby seals and we care about dolphins, but we don't care about babies.
Yeah.
We say Black Lives Matter, and yet 49% of all of the children killed in these abortuaries are beautiful black children.
Wow.
Joel says, therefore also, now saith the Lord, turn ye even to me with your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. You know, one of the hardest things to get over is guilt in your own life. Your heart condemns you because you know what you've done and you know who you were and you know what you were. And God said, if our heart condemn us, God is greater than our heart and knoweth all things. So even when your own heart is convicting you, God says, I'm greater than your heart. And I know all things. Beloved, if our heart condemn us not, we have confidence toward God. You know, there's a righteousness consciousness that comes with living righteously. So we all fail. That's not the point. But the point is, when I'm following hard after God, there develops in me a righteousness consciousness that just wells up in me. It changes me. It changes how I see myself, how I live my life. Because I have the confidence to understand that God loves me. We ask, and I did. Does your forgiveness, Lord, really cover all? Every one of those sins? Because as the pain and the memories and the sin come back, they're seeping from my very veins. But somehow God only remembers the good. Somehow God only remembers the good. He sees only the blood of the Redeemer.
Amen.
Somehow he only remembers the good. And when that wells up in us, that is revival.
Amen.
And when prayer comes,
Yep.
when prayer comes and prayer is our life, then revival comes. And as we are filled with that word, as we are filled with that joy, as we are filled with that power, God says, and out of your belly shall flow rivers of living water. And everybody around you gets wet.
Yeah.
You can't be around James Patrick and not hear about the things of God. It ain't going to happen. You walk into a restaurant and ask some weird looking guy, where do you go to church? Why? Because the love of God constrains him. He just overpowers him. That's who he is. We, unfortunately, in the church have used grace as an excuse for lawlessness. We see it in all the big churches. Well, I tell you, this church here is never about being a mega church. Ever. This church is about home study groups that teach people. Evangelism happens from your home, not from here. Evangelism happens from your home, from your heart, with the people you encounter. And as you encounter them and bring them into your group, they show up here on Sabbath for a collective meeting at synagogue. This is not the evangelistic arm of the operation. Each of us is. Each of you is. In the beginning was the Word, the revealed Word, the righteousness of God in the flesh. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. You see, that's what Pentecost is all about. Pentecost is the celebration of the giving of the law. From Mount Sinai, Moses came down with the tablets. Pentecost, that's what it was, the Feast of Weeks. That's how the Jews measure it, the Feast of Weeks. 7 sevens, and it's the morrow after the Sabbath after Passover. The morrow after the Sabbath after Passover is called the Day of First Fruits. Messiah rose from the grave on Sabbath. Crucified on a Wednesday, rose on the Sabbath, and guess what? He told Mary, don't touch me yet. I have not yet been to my Father.
Yes.
Why did he have to go to the Father? Because it was the celebration of first fruits, the wave offering. He'd already been the blood offering, now the wave offering, presenting himself to his Father. And now 7 weeks hence, Pentecost, the celebration of the giving of the law. That came from Mount Sinai. I believe the second time we celebrated Pentecost was when Messiah was born. I believe it was on Pentecost. Because it was a celebration of the giving of the law, and he was the law word in the flesh. The third major time we saw Pentecost was in that upper room. What happened? The law word came. And no longer would we have the tablets of stone, but the law written on the heart of man. The Logos, the revealed word, Messiah on the hearts of mankind. And this is it. Christ in you, the hope of glory.
Amen.
So here we are, 2020. The land is in ruins, the land is in riots, the left has taken over. Why have they taken over? Because nature and the spirit both abhor a vacuum. So when righteousness left, unrighteousness rushed in. And we're called to stand. And here's what John says. Hereby do we know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. Oh, wait a minute. That's isn't that works righteousness? We can't preach that. Well, don't tell me, tell God. He wrote it. And hereby do we know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. He that saith, I know him, and keepeth not his commandments, is a liar, and the truth is not in him. So all of these politicians running around telling you how much they love God and how much they're praying for America, what does God say?
Yeah.
You're liars.
Yeah.
You're liars.
Yes.
He said, now if you're going to follow me, don't be surprised, John 15:8. If the world hate you, you know that it hated me first.
Yes.
So you're going to have to be prepared to take a little heat. To be hated among men. In fact, if you're going to a church that is not hated among men, you better stop and find out where you sold God out. Because if you're following hard after God, you're not going to be loved. You're going to be hated by the world.
Yes.
So if everybody in town loves you, figure out why. We are late in history, folks. This is the time when the sheep and the goats are going to be separated.
Yes.
I think it's a time that is going to be unprecedented. We are seeing right now the trial run for the Antichrist, for the New World Order. That's what this is about. This is the anarchy. This is the chaos that is going to bring about the rise of the Antichrist. This is that time. We're seeing the dress rehearsal right now.
Wow.
World War I led to World War II. World War I, by the way, started on the 9th of Av. The Jews were ordered to be murdered by Hitler on the 9th of Av.
Wow.
But what caused Hitler? World War I. The Treaty of Versailles. It was so draconian, so violent against the people of Germany that they had no choice but at some point in time to rebel. And they did. And out of that chaos and confusion and panic and poverty and distress, Hitler rose. Why? Because he could promise people something. I'll give you something. I'll make you a people again. So when everything is dark across the globe, from that, the Antichrist will rise. And that's about where we are right now. But God knows these things. He knows where we are. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Nothing surprises him. He says, I'm the Alpha and the Omega. I begin to the beginning of time, and I've been to the end of time. And these things must come. But God gave me a word. As I was preparing, and I'll tell you how I prepare. I really don't try and pick a text or sermon or something specific to tell people. I don't go to the Word to get a word to give to you. I try and just bathe in the Word of God, bathe in His presence. And this is where the faith part comes in. I get up and I never know what I'm going to say, which is a little scary sometimes. But it's about God. And I was praying last night. In fact, I had already walked to the car to go home. And I felt the Spirit urging me. So I went back to my office. And this is what came out of that visit.
Oh, America, my beloved, who are these scoffers who ride in the streets and vomit out platitudes? Where were they when I formed this nation from nothing and gave it life? Where were they when Columbus, my servant, sought out this land, braved the unknown to seek a place where surrendered believers, my people, could find a place to worship their God? Where were the rebellious blind dogs who speak my name and know nothing of me, when my people sailed stormy seas, braved the wilderness, hunger, hostile lands, and the terrors of the night, and came to this place with one dream in their heart, to be able to worship in spirit and in truth? Where were these sanctimonious yet unsanctified mockers when my spirit rolled like a rushing mighty wind across this land and breathed the fire of my spirit into the hearts of men and led to that day in July when my beloved land was birthed? Where were the sounding brass or tinkling cymbal politicians when men of valor stepped forward and took on the greatest army on planet Earth, committing their destiny to my loving care? Where were these vain voices when my people once again felt the fire of revival and detested the wickedness of slavery and died to set men free? America, America, that is love. Where have the preachers of righteousness gone? Where is the fire from these pretenders, these empty pulpits? Where is the call to holiness? You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Instead, they preach death and wrap it in putrid religious sentiment. In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Oh, America, I'm calling you back. O nation of prophecy, return to the God of your fathers. Let me again gather you under my love and bless you. Let me wipe away the tears. Heed your calling before the day comes when I call no more. Woe unto him that striveth with his Maker. Yahweh says, we are his. I have raised him up in righteousness. I will direct all his ways. He shall build me a city, and not for a price or not for reward, saith the Lord of hosts. But if you will, the sound of praise will fill the nation. The bell of liberty will ring again. But you must not live in fear of the wicked or of the nations. Trust in me, and I will fill you with my power and might. That sound you hear, that noise of tumult, of rebellion, sedition, and murder is the enemy of your faith and the enemy of your nation. And I will bring judgment. I will bring fire. For those who embrace anarchy, for those who would offer this land to Allah, I will bring judgment. You will know that I am God. Shout the victory. Raise the banner. For I will give you a man who will stand in the gap, and I will restrain their evil. Sound the shofar. Raise the signet. I am Yahweh. There is no God beside me. I am the light, and in me there is no darkness. Come and taste of my love, my liberty. Be my people. Fear not. For after the long night of terrors is the day of gladness. And it begins with revival, not of a nation or a state or even a city, but with you in brokenness before me, in fasting and in prayer, that I might anoint you with the oil of gladness and be your Redeemer.